Hello everybody, welcome back to an Infinity N5 video, and today we have our Lieutenant Guide. This video was brought about by a commenter, Potatoes Gaming, who asked me a very good question: what makes a good lieutenant, or how do I know what lieutenant to take? I was really inspired by this comment to make this video, so if you guys have anything else you want to hear from me or anything about Infinity, be sure to leave a comment and maybe a video can happen. So before we answer what are the traits that make a good lieutenant or what lieutenant should you take, let's have a look at what a lieutenant is. Lieutenants primarily are a list building restriction. Every list has to have a lieutenant, and thereby they're a restriction on that list. Additionally, they're a big point of vulnerability. The loss of lieutenant state is pretty catastrophic and comes about if your lieutenant is killed or isolated, or in any other kind of null state, and usually has a very catastrophic consequence on the game. Such a strong consequence that strategies for the first turn can involve just killing your opponent's lieutenant to buy you some time while you complete the mission and they have to scramble and scrape things together. But lieutenants are very special in that they also offer an opportunity to provide a list with extra orders or other advantages in skills. Finally, a lieutenant is also the unit whose whip is used at the start of the game for the lieutenant role, which decides who goes first, who goes second, etc. I think there are four broad categories of lieutenants. There are concession lieutenants, which are chosen due to their ease of use or low cost. These are things like line troop lieutenants, who are usually cheap, easy to decoy, provide a link bonus of some kind that's easy to capitalize on. The next ones are synergizers, lieutenants who provide synergy with other units. These are models like the Dahlia tactical unit, who provide 2 lieutenant orders that a list with NCO is able to capitalize on, or the Knight Commander, or even something like an interventor lieutenant, whose high skill is able to be used by the list to synergize with the wider network and units within it. Next up, we've got brawlers, and these are powerful units who benefit from the extra lieutenant order for an offensive benefit. This doesn't just mean guns, but it can very well mean guns, looking at tags or something like a Hetkari lieutenant, but it also includes something like an anathematic, who's using that lieutenant order offensively in a hacking capacity. Finally, you've got commanders, who are lieutenants who have extra skills like counterintelligence, strategos, things like that, that provide skills or opportunities that boost the list around it rather than being boosted themselves. Here we see the general ranking of categories of lieutenant, with concession lieutenants being the lowest by a decent margin. This is due to their opportunity cost. If you're taking a concession lieutenant, you're not taking one of the other kind of lieutenants who could bring more to your list. They offer very little to a list, but they're usually very easy to fit in and usually very easy to protect in a list. Synergizers are sort of your middle tier of lieutenants. They require other units to really shine or require a list to partially be built around them and can be restricting in that way. But, opposed to the concession lieutenants, they add some synergy or capability to a list. Then you've got your high tier of lieutenants. These are your brawlers and your commanders. Your brawlers are usually resilient units, meaning they're hard lieutenants to take down, and the extra order they gain from being the lieutenant increases their capability offensively. But, due to being placed in that line of fire and that offensive role, that makes them vulnerable. Finally, you've got commanders who are able to do things like provide extra orders, increase efficiency, or open up opportunities for other units, but their vulnerability point is they're usually very obvious. So now that we understand what an LT is and understand the 4 broad categories of lieutenant, how do we select a lieutenant for a list? Well, the first thing is that context really matters. Not all armies have access to broad, complex, or many varieties of lieutenant. Access to skills such as chain of command is really relevant. This leads to a lieutenant being a big restriction in some armies, while not really being a restriction in other armies, and then further armies who are able to make advantages out of their lieutenant. In all armies, you primarily have to consider what an LT brings to the list relative to its cost. We're going to start off with Vanilla 012 as an example of a faction that's able to make opportunities and advantages with its lieutenants. So let's take a look. The 012 context is a very special one, as they have the cheapest chain of command in the game, which reduces vulnerabilities in your lieutenants, which is most appreciated by Brawler and Commander lieutenants. Chain of command increases the opportunity cost of running a Synergizer or a Concession lieutenant, as you have the tools to really make the higher tier lieutenants shine. High quality Brawler and Commander lieutenants present opportunities and not restrictions. In this way, when you're building an 012 list, you're not looking at your lieutenants going, okay, what's my restriction? You're looking at your lieutenants in the capacity of, okay, what's my opportunity? In terms of concession lieutenants, you have quite a few, but the ones that you may have seen the most may be the Raven Eye or the Kappa. Synergizers are a bit rarer and include the Omega and Silver Star, who mostly synergize due to their link options and tin bots. In terms of brawlers, you have the Zeta and Gamma, who are both very popular lieutenants. And finally, your commander lieutenants are the Alpha and Sonya, who provide some wider benefit to the list. There is competition within the brackets though, starting with the concession lieutenants. The Kappa lieutenant, it's going to cost you 0.5 SWIC. It's not going to offer you any value to the list, but it's very easy to slot in. Unfortunately, what makes it difficult is that it's pretty slot intensive to decoy. Having 2 random Kappas in there isn't going to bring you any value to your list. On top of costing that SWIC, that means the Kappa's really pushed out compared to what you could be bringing. The blue code's very similar. It offers very little value to a list, and it's quite expensive compared to the Kappa. If you do choose to go down the alternate route instead of just decoying and taking the cheaper chain of command, you're probably better off taking a better unit to really leverage that chain of command you've chosen to take. Cho is sort of in the middle tier of a concession lieutenant. She protects herself via Hollow Mask, but doesn't offer any wider benefit to the list, and is more expensive than a Raven Eye. Finally, the Raven Eye presents the creme de la creme of concession lieutenants in Vanilla 012, where the mine layer protects itself, the mine layer adds to a deployment zone defense, and it's the cheapest option. But the main issue is that there is a massive opportunity cost to taking concession lieutenants in Vanilla 012 when you have that context surrounding you of your lieutenant being an opportunity, not a liability. This extends to Synergizer lieutenants, where while you do have some, they're not as powerful and the faction isn't as geared towards taking those lieutenants. Looking at the Brawler lieutenants, we can see in the top tier we've got the Gamma and the Zeta. The Gamma provides near tag level firepower and is immune to isolation due to Warhorse, while the Zeta is the best gun in the faction, very survivable, but does require some tag infrastructure like engineers and etc. Stepping out of Vanilla 012 and going to Starmada, you've got Hector, who is similar in style to a Brawler lieutenant, but provides some benefit of a Commander lieutenant with Strategos and other abilities. Unfortunately, with a BS-13, he doesn't really excel in offensive effectiveness. His weapons also hold him back as shorter to mid-range guns, and that's really uncharitable when his point cost competes with that of the Zeta. If you are choosing to take a Brawler lieutenant, you need to make sure the one you're taking is really doing well for its points, and that leads to the golden rule of, would I take this unit anyway? If it was not my lieutenant, would I still take it as a Brawler? Hector sort of sits on the line where I don't think you really would, where the Gamma and Zeta, you look at their profiles and go, okay, if these weren't my lieutenant, I think I would probably still take them. And that's when you know a Brawler lieutenant is really worth your time. You've got a couple of command lieutenants. You have the Alpha, who provides Strategos level 1, which includes a free extra reserve and an extra order per turn, where you don't need any NCO. It also provides an extra command token, and has counterintelligence, but really suffers from its large base. You've also got Sonya, who I've put quite low, She provides a SWIC and is linkable, but is quite fragile. But what you really need to ask with a commander lieutenant is, what are the practical benefits in the context of the faction? O12 as a faction isn't very SWIC hungry, and you usually run out of points before you run out of either slots or SWIC, and I wager you run out of slots before SWIC in the vast majority of cases. Sonya being linkable is great, but she's not going to provide any pure duo bonuses, and her moving up the field only exacerbates her fragility. While on paper Sonya does provide a benefit that's quite good and unique from the alpha, in the wider context the alpha provides a much better practical benefit in the context of the faction. Altogether, let's take a look at the lieutenants you have available to you in Vanilla O12. Up here in the top tier, we have the Gamma, the Alpha, and the Zeta, two brawlers who passed our golden rule of being good enough to take anyway, and the Alpha, who passed our goal in the commander option of being a unit who really adds to the list in a way that practically benefits the list and heightens the power level. We've got the Raven Eye in the mid tier, as while he is quite a good concession lieutenant, in the faction and in the context, we're not interested in a Raven Eye due to the opportunity cost of taking a concession lieutenant. And then the rest past the Raven Eye all fail the value versus opportunity cost test. What value is this lieutenant going to bring to me versus the opportunity cost of not taking one of the 4 lieutenants here on screen? It's quite high. Now, while that's good at excluding models, which model do we actually pick from here? Well, you need to look at your lieutenant options and say, what's going to bring the most value to my list to then pick your lieutenant? Some lists in a mission like Firefight or Decap might really value that Zeta, where something like Highly Classified or a very order-intensive mission like Supplies might lean more towards that Alpha. It all depends on the list and all depends on the mission. Now let's change gears completely and look at Corregidor, who's a faction that's really held back by their lieutenant choices, and whose lieutenant choices provide a tangible restriction and very little to no opportunity. In the Corregidor context, we have 0 brawler or commander-lieutenant options. There is no chain of command and a very limited lieutenant selection, and in this way, the limited selection of lieutenants presents a restriction and does not present opportunities like it does in O12. Corregidor has 3 concession lieutenants in the Alguacil, Wildcat, and Mobile Regatta, and has 1 Synergizer lieutenant in one of the Mobile Regatta profiles. As said earlier, we have no brawler or commander lieutenants. Looking at the faction as a whole, you have the Wildcat, who, as just a vanilla Wildcat, is extremely obvious as your lieutenant. It's expensive to decoy, and has a very redundant kit. Furthermore, it provides a less valuable bonus in a link team, as 2 just vanilla Wildcats aren't really the basis to build anything powerful off of. The Alguacil moves up to sort of a mid-tier, as while it does cost SWIC, it's easy to decoy, and the decoy and the lieutenant provide a relevant bonus you can build something around a lot better. Finally, you've got the Brigada, who is a fine but not fantastic lieutenant, but probably top of the faction, whose Tinbot Neg 6 profile provides list synergy with linkable hackers, and he's very survivable, but unfortunately he's extremely expensive and can prove a lot of pressure on the points of a list. So the golden rule with a faction like Corregidor, where your faction presents a restriction in your lieutenant rather than an opportunity, the golden rule is to ask, what hampers my list the least? A lot of times this way you can look at what's important to me. In this case, is it points, is it SWIC? That'll help me determine between the Mobile Regatta and the Alguacil. What links am I wanting to run? What size of links? That sort of thing. But the Wildcat really gets pushed out as this will be hampering my list the most. I hope you've enjoyed this very short video, and I really do thank you for watching. Again, this video was inspired by a commenter, so if you want to see something, feel free to reach out and say something. Please like and subscribe, ring the bell, tell your mom about the videos, tell your neighbors.